me. Surprise. Surprise. I even said the last time I'm gonna come back on Wednesday, 9 a.m. Chicago time, but it turns out I have a little time this morning. Oh, I need to turn this on. So now that I have everyone trained to come on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays, I will switch it up. Ooh, whoa, stop that. Dog. So good morning to myself. This will just be a surprise bonus episode, I guess, for people. And maybe I should just start reading. Let's see if anybody comes in. I shouldn't have done this to people. Just switch it up because this is such an important, critical chapter. Maybe not. They're all critical and important. And before I start reading, I'll just say my new obsession is frozen mandarin oranges. I can't believe I've lived this long on planet Earth and I never thought to freeze a mandarin orange before and eat it. It's really good, really delicious. I want everyone to do it. I was telling a lady in the checkout line yesterday to do it. Actually, not just any lady, it was somebody I knew, but still. Okay, I guess I'll just start reading to myself. Chapter 6. Andrew's in here. Good. Somebody's in here. I was just saying, now that everyone's trained not to show up on Tuesday, that's when I show up, right? There's a chance that the phone will ring as we're reading this, and I have to answer it. But maybe not. Maybe this will be short. Are you ready? Marilla makes up her mind. Okay. They're getting to White Sands, as you'll recall. And we learned, excuse me. We learned we learned a little bit about Anne yesterday. Oh, my voice. Yeah, I wish. I wish I could let somebody else answer this call and just deal with everything that has to do with this, but unfortunately that person is me. I'm the hero, the main character, as the kids say. Have you heard that lately? I had to ask the kids to explain that concept to me. When someone thinks they're a main character. And I'm like, I feel like I really need to know this bit of colloquialism since I love to read. Okay. All right, let's read this. Marilla makes up her mind. It's really not that long. Get there they did, however, in due season. Mrs. Spencer lived in a big yellow house at White Sands Cove, and she came to the door with surprise and welcome mingled on her benevolent face. Dear, dear, she exclaimed, you're the last folks I was looking for today, but I'm real glad to see you. You put your horse in? And how are you, Anne? I'm as well as can be expected, thank you, said Anne smilelessly. A blight seemed to have descended on her. I suppose we'll stay a little while to rest the mare, said Marilla, but I promised Matthew I'd be home early. The fact is, Mrs. Spencer, there's been a queer mistake somewhere, and I've come over to see where it is. We sent word, Matthew and I, for you to bring us a boy from the asylum. We told your brother Robert to tell you we wanted a boy, 10 or 11 years old. Marilla Cuthbert, you don't say so, said Mrs. Spencer in distress. Why, Robert sent the word down by his daughter Nancy, and she said you wanted a girl. Didn't she, Flora Jane? So it sounds like a case of telephone, people playing telephone. And who knows, if it was Matthew, what if he just had one of his like shy spells come over him and he had a Freudian slip and Matthew actually said girl, since he's so afraid of them. Didn't she, Flora Jane? Appealing to her daughter who had come out to the steps. She certainly did, Miss Cuthbert, corroborated Flora Jane earnestly. I'm dreadfully sorry, said Mrs. Spencer. It's too bad, but it certainly wasn't my fault, you see, Miss Cuthbert. I did the best I could, and I thought I was following your instructions. Nancy is a terribly flighty thing. I've often had to scold her well for her heedlessness. It was our own fault, said Marilla resignedly. We should have come to you ourselves and not left an important message to be passed along by word of mouth in that fashion. Anyhow, the mistake has been made, and the only thing to do now is to set it right. Can we send the child back to the asylum? I suppose they'll take her back, won't they? I suppose so, said Mrs. Spencer thoughtfully, but I don't think it will be necessary to send her back. Mrs. Peter Blewett was up here yesterday, and she was saying to me how much she wished she'd sent by me for a little girl to help her. Mrs. Peter has a large family, you know, and she finds it hard to get help. Anne will be the very girl for her. I call it positively providential. Marilla did not look as if she thought Providence had much to do with the matter. Here was an unexpectedly good chance to get this unwelcome orphan off her hands, and she did not even feel grateful for it. She knew Mrs. Blewett only by sight as a small, shrewish-faced woman, without an ounce of superfluous flesh on her bones. No dimples in her elbows. But she had heard her, a terrible worker and driver. Mrs. Peter was said to be, and discharged servant girls told fearsome tales of her temper and stinginess, and her family of pert, quarrelsome children. Marilla felt a qualm of conscience at the thought of handing Anne over to her tender mercies. Well, I'll go in and we'll talk the matter over, she said. And if there isn't Mrs. Peter coming up the lane this very instant. Oh my gosh. This blessed minute, I mean, exclaimed Mrs. Spencer, bustling her guests through the hall into the parlor where a deadly chill struck on them as if the air had been strained so long through dark green, closely drawn blinds that had lost every particle of warmth it had ever possessed. Why are they dark green? Dark green, closely drawn blinds. That is so specific, isn't it? That is real lucky, for we can settle the matter right away. Take the armchair, Miss Cuthbert, and you sit here on the ottoman. Don't wiggle. Let me take your hats. Flora Jane, go out and put the kettle on. Good afternoon, Mrs. Blewett. Oh, Kelly, I lied. It turned out I had some free time this morning. And I decided to trick everyone. Thanks for coming in. We're just getting to a juicy part. Good afternoon, Mrs. Blewett. We were just saying how fortunate it was you happened along. Let me introduce you two ladies. Mrs. Blewett, Miss Cuthbert. Please excuse me for just a moment. I forgot to tell Flora Jane to take the buns out of the oven. Oh my goodness. Mrs. Spencer whisked away after pulling up the blinds. Anne, sitting mutely on the ottoman with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, stared at Mrs. Blewett as one fascinated. Was she to be given into keeping of this sharp-faced, sharp-eyed woman? She felt a lump coming up in her throat, and her eyes smarted painfully. She was beginning to be afraid she couldn't keep the tears back when Mrs. Spencer returned, flushed and beaming, quite capable of taking any and every difficulty, physical, mental, or spiritual, into consideration and settling it out of hand. "It seems there's been a mistake about this little girl, Mrs. Blewett," she said. "I was under the impression that Mr. and Miss Cuthbert wanted a little girl to adopt. I was certainly told so. But it seems it was a boy they wanted. So if you're still of the same mind you were yesterday, I think she'll be just the thing for you." Mrs. Blewett darted her eyes over Anne from head to foot. "How old are you, and what's your name?" she demanded. "Anne Shirley," faltered the shrinking child, not daring to make any stipulations regarding the spelling thereof. "And I'm 11 years old." "Humph! You don't look as if there was much to you, but you're wiry." "I don't know, but the wiry ones are the best, after all." "Well, if I take you, you'll have to be a good girl, you know, good and smart and respectful." "I'll expect you to earn your keep, and no mistake about that. Yes, I suppose I might as well take her off your hands, Miss Cuthbert. The baby's awful fractious, and I'm clean worn out attending to him. If you'd like, I can take her home right now." Fractious. Start using that word. Marilla looked at Anne and softened at the sight of the child's pale face with its look of mute misery, the misery of a helpless little creature who finds itself once more caught in the trap from which it had escaped. Marilla felt an uncomfortable conviction that if she denied the appeal of that look, it would haunt her to her dying day. My. Moreover, she did not fancy Mrs. Blewett to hand a sensitive, high-strung child over to such a woman. No, she could not take the responsibility of doing that. "Well, I don't know," she said slowly. "I didn't say that Matthew and I had absolutely decided that we wouldn't keep her. In fact, I may say that Matthew is disposed to keep her. I just came over to find out how the mistake had occurred. I think I'd better take her home again and talk it over with Matthew. I feel that I oughtn't to decide on anything without consulting him. If we make up our mind not to keep her, we'll bring or send her over to you tomorrow night. If we don't, you may know that she's going to stay with us. Will that suit you, Mrs. Blewett?" "I suppose it'll have to," said Mrs. Blewett ungraciously. During Marilla's speech, a sunrise had been dawning on Anne's face. First the look of despair faded out, and then came a faint flush of hope. Her eyes grew deep and bright as morning stars. The child was quite transfigured. And a moment later, when Mrs. Spencer and Mrs. Blewett went out in quest of a recipe the latter had come to borrow, she sprang up and flew across the room to Marilla. "Oh, Miss Cuthbert, did you really say that perhaps you would let me stay at Green Gables?" she said in a breathless whisper, as if speaking aloud might shatter the glorious possibility. "Did you really say it? Or did I only imagine that you did? I think you'd better learn to control that imagination of yours, Anne, if you can't distinguish between what is real and what isn't," said Marilla crossly. "Yes, you did hear me say just that and no more. It isn't decided yet, and perhaps we will conclude to let Mrs. Blewett take you after all. She certainly needs you much more than I do." "I'd rather go back to the asylum than go live with her," said Anne passionately. "She looks exactly like a gimlet." Marilla smothered a smile under the conviction that Anne must be reproved for such a speech. "A little girl like you should be ashamed for talking so about a lady and a stranger," she said severely. "Go back and sit down quietly and hold your tongue and behave as a good girl should." "I'll try to do and be anything you want me, if you'll only keep me," said Anne, returning meekly to her ottoman. When they arrived back at Green Gables that evening, Matthew met them in the lane. Marilla, from afar, had noted him prowling along it and guessed his motive. She was prepared for the relief she read in his face when he saw that she had at least brought Anne back with her. But she said nothing to him relative to the affair until they were both out in the yard behind the barn milking the cows. Then she briefly told him Anne's history and the result of the interview with Mrs. Spencer. Pause. Don't you, this is one thing, like one advantage to being in a relationship with someone And in Marilla's case, it's her brother that she's living with, but still they have a kind of domestic partnership, right? Where they have to make decisions together, but like you obviously have a dominant person in the relationship, and most relationships are like this. I haven't really encountered one that isn't like a dominant one in someone who like usually there's one that makes the decision, like the final decision, because you do have two people. There has to be like a bit of a tiebreaker energy, and Marilla is like the more dominant decision maker in their partnership. But she has Matthew to like blame it on, to be like, well, I have to talk it over with Matthew, even though it was obviously her decision from the beginning. And Matthew Matthew's just kind of the scapegoat, but he also used Marilla when he was taking Anne home, like thinking like it's a good thing Marilla is like the decision maker, because I don't want to have to tell Anne that we can't keep her, like that he can't do that, right? I wouldn't give a dog I liked to that Blewett woman, said Matthew with unusual vim. I don't fancy her style myself, admitted Marilla, but it's that or keeping her ourselves, Matthew. And since you seem to want her, I suppose I'm willing, or have to be. I've been thinking over the idea until I've got kind of used to it. It seems a sort of duty. I've never brought up a child, especially a girl, and I dare say I'll make a terrible mess of it, but I'll do my best. So as far as I'm concerned, Matthew, she may stay. Matthew's shy face was a glow of delight. Well, now, I reckon you'd come to see it in that light, Marilla, he said. She's such an interesting little thing. It'd be more to the point if you could say she was a useful little thing, retorted Marilla, but I'll make it my business to see that she's trained to be that. And mind, Matthew, you're not to go interfering with my methods. Perhaps an old maid doesn't know much about bringing up a child, but I guess she knows more than an old bachelor. So you just leave me to manage her. When I fail, it'll be time enough to put your oar in. There, Marilla, you can have your own way, said Matthew reassuringly. Only be as good and kind to her as you can without spoiling her. I kind of think she's one of the sort you can do anything with if you only get her to love you. Marilla sniffed to express her contempt for Matthew's opinions concerning anything feminine and walked off to the dairy with the pails. I won't tell her tonight that she can stay, she reflected as she strained the milk into creamers. She'd be so excited that she wouldn't sleep a wink. Marilla Cuthbert, you're fairly in for it. Did you ever suppose you'd see the day when you'd be adopting an orphan girl? It's surprising enough, but not so surprising as that Matthew should be at the bottom of it. Him that always seemed to have such a mortal dread of little girls. Anyhow, we've decided on the experiment, and goodness only knows what will come of it. The experiment! Oh my gosh. The next chapter is really short. Are you all still here? Somebody comment and let me know you're still here and listening, and since I've only been on here a little bit, I'll go ahead and read this next short chapter if you're into it. I feel like I'm just warmed up. You're here, Kelly? Okay. And this is a sweet little chapter scene that we're going to read. All right. 7. Yes, Andrew's here. Good. Anne says her prayers. Ow. Oh, I just rolled my elbow off of this thing. My dimpled elbow. When Marilla took Anne up to bed. Oh, good. And thank you. Very kindly. When Marilla took Anne up to bed that night, she said stiffly, "Now, Anne, I noticed last night that you threw your clothes all about the floor when you took them off. That is a very untidy habit, and I can't allow it at all. As soon as you take off any article of clothing, fold it neatly and place it on the chair. I haven't any use at all for little girls who aren't neat." "I was so harrowed up in my mind last night that I didn't think about my clothes at all," said Anne. "I'll fold them nicely tonight. They always made us do that at the asylum. Half the time, though, I'd forget. I'd be in such a hurry to get into bed, nice and quiet, and imagine things." "You'll have to remember a little better if you stay here," admonished Marilla. "There, that looks something like, 'Say your prayers now and get into bed.'" "I never say any prayers," announced Anne. Marilla looked with horrified astonishment. "Why, Anne, what do you mean? Were you never taught to say your prayers? God always wants little girls to say their prayers. Don't you know who God is, Anne? God is a spirit, infinite, eternal, and unchangeable in his being, wisdom, power, holiness, justice, goodness, and truth," responded Anne promptly and glibly. Marilla looked rather relieved. "So you do know something then. Thank goodness. You're not quite a heathen. Where did you learn that?" "Oh, at the asylum Sunday school. They made us learn the whole catechism. I liked it pretty well." "There's something splendid about some of the words. Infinite, eternal, and unchangeable. Isn't that grand? It has such a roll to it. Just like a big organ playing. I almost said orphan. You couldn't quite call it poetry, I suppose, but it sounds a lot like it, doesn't it?" "We're not talking about poetry, Anne. We're talking about saying your prayers. Don't you know it's a terrible, wicked thing not to say your prayers every night? I'm afraid you're a very bad little girl." "You'd find it easier to be bad than good if you had red hair," said Anne reproachfully. "People who haven't red hair don't know what trouble it is. Mrs. Thomas told me that God made my hair red on purpose, and I've never cared about him since. And anyway, I'd always be too tired at night to bother saying prayers. People who have to look after twins can't be expected to say their prayers. Now, do you honestly think they can?" Oh my gosh. It's like with everyone. If you're just gonna, you just can't win the hearts and minds of people if you automatically tell them that they're bad, um, and then expect them to change to want to be good. Well, if you're already bad, what's the impetus to change? Marilla decided that Anne's religious training must be begun at once. Plainly, there was no time to be lost. "You must say your prayers while you're under my roof, Anne." "Why, of course, if you want me to," assented Anne cheerfully. "I'd do anything to oblige you. But you'll have to tell me what to say for this once. After I get into bed, I'll imagine out a real nice prayer to say always. I believe that it will be quite interesting now that I come to think of it." "You must kneel down," said Marilla in embarrassment. Anne knelt at Marilla's knee and looked up gravely. "Why must people kneel down to pray? If I really wanted to pray, I'll tell you what I'd do. I'd go out into a great big field all alone, or into the deep, deep woods, and I'd look up to the sky, up, 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 into that lovely blue sky that looks as if there was no end to its blueness, and then I'd just feel a prayer." I would just feel it. "Well, I'm ready. What am I to say?" Marilla felt more embarrassed than ever. She had intended to teach Anne the childish classic, "Now I lay me down to sleep," but she had, as I have told you, the glimmerings of a sense of humor, which is simply another name for a sense of the fitness of things, and it suddenly occurred to her that that simple little prayer, sacred to white-robed children, lisping at motherly knees, was entirely unsuited to this freckled witch of a girl who knew and cared nothing about God's love, since she had never had it translated to her through the medium of human love. She's very a born mystic, right? Anne is. You're old enough to pray for yourself, Anne, she said finally. Just thank God for your blessings and ask him humbly for the things you want. Well, I'll do my best, promised Anne, burying her face in Marilla's lap. Graciously, Heaven Father, that's the way the ministers say it in church, so I suppose it's all right in a private prayer, isn't it? She interjected, lifting her head for a moment. Gracious Heavenly Father, I thank thee for the white way of delight, and the lake of shining waters, and Bonnie and the Snow Queen. I'm really grateful for them, extremely grateful for them, and that's all the blessings I can think of just now to thank thee for. As for the things I want, they're so numerous that I could take a great deal of time to name them all, so I will only mention the two most important. Please let me stay at Green Gables, and please let me be good looking when I grow up. I remain yours respectfully, Anne Shirley. There, did I do it all right? She asked eagerly, getting up. I could have made it much more flowery if I had a little more time to think it over. Poor Marilla was only preserved from complete collapse by remembering that it was not irreverence but simply spiritual ignorance on the part of Anne that was responsible for this extraordinary petition. She tucked the child up in bed, mentally vowing that she should be taught a prayer. Did you love this show, Kimberly? It's such a good show. The movie and Anne with an E. If you haven't watched it on Netflix yet, oh, please do. Treat yourself. Okay, she tucked the child up in bed, mentally vowing that she should be taught a prayer the very next day, and was leaving the room with the light when Anne called back. I've just thought of it now. I should have said amen in place of yours respectfully, shouldn't I? The way ministers do. I'd forgotten it, but I felt a prayer should be finished off in some way, so I put in the other. Do you suppose it will make any difference? I don't suppose it will, said Marilla. Go to sleep now like a good child. Good night. I can say good night tonight with a clear conscience, said Anne, cuddling. Thank you for the subscription. Cuddling luxuriously down among her pillows. Marilla retreated to the kitchen, set the candle firmly on the table, and glared at Matthew. Matthew Cuthbert, it's about time somebody adopted that child and taught her something. She's next door to a perfect heathen. Will you believe she never said a prayer in her life till tonight? I'll send to the manse tomorrow and borrow the Peep of Day series. That's what I'll do. And she shall go to Sunday school just as soon as I can get some suitable clothes made for her. I foresee that I shall have my hands full. Well, we can't get through this world without our share of trouble. I've had a pretty easy life of it so far, but my time has come at last, and I suppose I'll have to make the best of it. Oh my gosh, Marilla. I could almost read another chapter, but I won't. I'll leave you with this. What do we think? Do you want to do you have any thoughts about Anne's heathenish ways? I love it. She's like a natural mystic, a natural I guess heathen, a natural pagan anyway. She loves nature and her idea of she really did, Kimberly, and her idea of the spiritual feelings isn't found in like a church or a hymnal or some rote prayer, but out in nature, which I love that about her. And now Marilla has a project, and I think that it's clear from the description in the book of Mrs. Rachel Lynde coming up into the yard that seems to be so clean swept and immaculate, and she goes into the farmhouse and into Green Gables, and everything is so immaculate and clean and neat as a pin that Marilla has perfectionist tendencies, and Anne is kind of the opposite of that, right? She's this free spirit, bohemian, nature mystic waif magical imaginative child. And so you would think that there's going to be major personality clashes, and maybe Anne has to give a little. They're already asking Anne to change, right? Already asking her to change. And every good book, in every good story, the character changes somehow, in some way, becomes more fully themselves or more integrated in a way. So it looks like, and Matthew has already changed, right? He's already less shy. He's spoken up a couple times, kind of spoken out against Marilla, like her overbearing nature, in in his affection for Anne. And so Marilla hasn't changed yet, but that's going to be interesting to watch, isn't it? All right, I guess that's it. Everybody have a wonderful